Picture this moment. You're at a dinner party. Someone brings up climate change. Within seconds, your uncle, who watched one YouTube video last week, is debating a climate scientist with 30 years of research. And here's the disturbing part. Half the table thinks your uncle is winning, not because his arguments are stronger, but because he speaks with absolute certainty, while the scientist carefully qualifies every statement with the data, suggests and we need more research. We've built a world where confidence has become indistinguishable from competence, where the person who admits complexity gets dismissed as weak, while the person who reduces everything to simple slogans gets celebrated as a visionary. Socrates warned about this exact moment. He said the greatest wisdom is knowing what you don't know. But we've created systems that punish intellectual humility and reward performative certainty. Social media platforms don't promote careful analysis. They promote engagement. And nothing engages quite like someone who speaks with absolute conviction about things they barely understand. Here's what this video is not. This isn't about intelligence or education level. You can have multiple degrees and still display the behavioral patterns we're examining. This is about something more dangerous. A cultural shift where we've stopped valuing truth and started valuing only what captures attention. Where we've confused being loud with being right. Where we've mistaken viral moments for wisdom. The ancient Greeks had a word for this. They called it the tyranny of the ignorant. When societies elevate certainty over curiosity, when they reward simplistic answers over complex thinking, when they celebrate winning arguments over discovering truth, they begin a slow descent into chaos. Socrates spent his life fighting this pattern. He would walk through Athens asking questions, not to humiliate people, but to expose how little any of us truly understand. The city eventually executed him for it. They couldn't tolerate someone who kept reminding them of their own ignorance. But his warning survived, and 25 centuries later, it's more relevant than ever. So how do you know if you're living in an idiocracy? There are 6 unmistakable signs, 6 symptoms that reveal a culture has stopped thinking and started performing. 6 patterns Socrates would recognize instantly. Let's examine each one, because once you see these patterns, you can't unsee them. And that's when the real work begins. There's a psychological phenomenon that explains much of what's broken in public discourse. It's called the Dunning-Kruger effect. Researchers discovered something fascinating about human cognition. People with limited knowledge in a domain dramatically overestimate their competence. Meanwhile, actual experts tend to underestimate theirs. Think about the last person you saw go viral for confidently explaining something complex: cryptocurrency, geopolitics, nutrition science. Chances are they weren't an expert in the field. They were someone who consumed just enough information to sound authoritative, but not enough to recognize how much they don't know. Here's the mechanism. When you know very little about something, you lack the knowledge to recognize the gaps in your understanding. You can't see what you're missing because you haven't learned enough to know what you should be looking for. It's only when you develop genuine expertise that you begin to see the complexity, the variables you hadn't considered, the edge cases that complicate simple rules, the research that contradicts your initial assumptions. Socrates understood this perfectly. He said, the only true wisdom is knowing you know nothing. But we've built platforms that reward the opposite. Algorithms don't naturally promote careful measured analysis. They promote confidence, controversy, conflict, because that's what generates engagement. And engagement is the only currency that matters. Consider how expertise has been devalued in recent years. Medical professionals who spent decades studying immunology get dismissed by people who spent an evening watching conspiracy videos. Economists with Nobel Prizes get told they're wrong by podcasters who barely passed high school math. Climate scientists presenting 40 years of data get debated by politicians who think snowballs disprove global warming. Now let's be honest about something uncomfortable. There are legitimate reasons people have become skeptical of experts. The financial crisis happened because people with impressive credentials made catastrophically bad decisions. Pharmaceutical companies have hidden harmful side effects. Intelligence agencies have lied about weapons of mass destruction. When someone says they don't trust experts anymore, they're often responding to real betrayals. The problem isn't skepticism itself. Socrates would have celebrated healthy skepticism. The problem is when we respond to the failure of some experts by concluding that expertise itself is worthless, when we decide that careful study means nothing and anyone's opinion is equally valid. That's not skepticism. That's intellectual nihilism. And it creates a bizarre inversion. The less you know, the more confident you feel. And in a system that rewards confidence above all else, ignorance becomes a competitive advantage. Watch any cable news debate. The person who admits nuance or uncertainty gets interrupted and dismissed. The person who speaks in absolute terms and never wavers gets praised for their conviction. We've gamified knowledge in the worst possible way. The goal isn't to understand. It's to perform understanding convincingly enough to accumulate followers. Plato wrote that opinion is the medium between knowledge and ignorance, but we've collapsed that distinction entirely. We treat strong opinions as if they were knowledge. We mistake certainty for wisdom, and the actual experts, the people who have spent years studying these topics, often stay quiet, because they know how complex the issues actually are, and in a culture that punishes complexity, silence sometimes seems like the safest option. Which brings us to a crucial question. When was the last time you heard someone say, "I don't know," and have that statement received as wisdom rather than weakness? When did you last see someone rewarded for admitting uncertainty? That's how you know the inversion is complete. When ignorance masquerading as confidence succeeds, while expertise expressing appropriate caution fails. Socrates was executed for asking too many questions, for making people confront how little they truly understood. Today we don't execute our Socrates. We just scroll past them, looking for someone who'll give us simple answers with absolute confidence, even if those answers are completely wrong. Socrates believed knowledge should transform you, not just add facts to your memory, but fundamentally change how you see reality, how you treat other people, how you understand yourself. Knowledge required discipline, reflection, the courage to have your beliefs challenged and potentially destroyed. Now watch how we consume information today. We scroll through endless feeds of content labeled educational or insightful. We watch 5-minute videos explaining complex philosophical concepts. We bookmark articles we'll never read. We screenshot quotes and share them without contemplating what they actually mean. We've turned knowledge into fast food, quick, convenient, designed for maximum satisfaction with minimum effort. The goal isn't transformation. It's the brief dopamine hit of feeling like you learned something without doing the hard work of actually changing. Think about the explosion of productivity content. Billions of people consume this material every day. Morning routines, time management systems, focus techniques, networking strategies. They absorb this information enthusiastically. They take notes. They feel motivated. But here's the question that matters. How many actually implement what they learn? How many find their lives genuinely transformed 6 months later? The consumption itself has become the goal. We collect information like badges, displaying our awareness of various concepts without ever letting those concepts actually reshape our thinking. We mistake the accumulation of facts for the cultivation of wisdom. This is exactly what Socrates feared. He understood that real knowledge demands discomfort. It requires you to confront your own ignorance, to question beliefs you've held for years, to sit with uncertainty instead of rushing toward easy answers. That process isn't entertaining. It doesn't fit into short-form content. It can't be optimized or gamified. But when knowledge becomes primarily entertainment, something fundamental shifts. We begin confusing information with understanding. People can recite facts without grasping their implications. Everyone has opinions about everything, but wisdom about very little. The appearance of knowledge becomes more valuable than knowledge itself. Consider how we treat documentaries versus academic papers. A well-produced documentary with dramatic music and compelling visuals gets millions of views. The actual peer-reviewed research it's based on gets read by maybe a few hundred people. We prefer the digestible version, the one that makes us feel informed without requiring us to wrestle with methodology or contradictory evidence. Social media accelerates this pattern. Every platform rewards content that can be consumed quickly, that generates immediate emotional reactions, that feels satisfying in the moment. But genuine learning rarely feels satisfying in the moment. It often feels frustrating, confusing, sometimes even painful as your previous understanding gets dismantled. Plato said that knowledge, which is acquired under compulsion, obtains no hold on the mind. But the inverse is also true. Knowledge acquired without any effort rarely transforms anything. When was the last time you spent an hour thinking deeply about one idea? When did you last read something difficult and allow yourself to not understand it immediately? When did knowledge change you rather than simply entertain you? These aren't rhetorical questions. They're diagnostic tools. If you can't remember the last time learning felt difficult, you might not actually be learning. You might just be consuming content that makes you feel smart. There's a difference, and in an idiocracy, that difference disappears entirely. Here's something Socrates couldn't have predicted because the technology didn't exist. What happens when there's a financial incentive to make people angry? We're living in an attention economy. Media companies, social platforms, content creators, they all compete for the same scarce resource: your time, your engagement, your emotional investment. And they've discovered something profound about human psychology. Nothing captures attention quite like outrage. Watch how information spreads in the modern world. A story appears, often incomplete, sometimes misleading, occasionally entirely fabricated, but it triggers strong emotions, anger, fear, moral indignation. That emotional charge makes it spread faster than any careful analysis ever could. By the time fact-checkers examine the claim, millions have already internalized it as truth. By the time context gets added, the narrative has already calcified. By the time corrections are issued, everyone has moved on to the next outrage. This isn't a bug in the system. It's the core feature. Platforms optimize for engagement. Outrage engages. News outlets compete for clicks. Anger generates clicks. Content creators battle for views. Controversy gets views. The entire economic structure of modern media rewards content that makes you feel something intense, preferably something that divides you into tribes and keeps you arguing. Socrates taught his students to think for themselves. But independent thought requires something difficult: the ability to step back from your immediate emotional reaction and ask whether what you're feeling is justified by the facts. It requires questioning whether the source might have reasons to manipulate your emotions. It requires seeking perspectives that challenge your initial reaction. Our current information environment makes this extraordinarily difficult, not impossible. But every algorithm, every business model, every incentive structure is designed to keep you emotionally engaged, not rationally informed. Think about the last time something made you genuinely furious online. Now think about what happened next. Did you immediately seek out the full context? Did you look for credible sources to verify the claim? Did you consider whether your anger was being deliberately provoked to generate engagement? Or did you share it immediately because it confirmed what you already believed? This is how the outrage economy functions. It doesn't matter if the information is accurate. What matters is whether it generates engagement. And accuracy is often less engaging than partial truths presented in inflammatory ways. The psychological impact is devastating. We're kept in a constant state of reactivity, always angry about something, always ready to attack, always certain that we're on the right side, and anyone who disagrees must be evil or stupid. Movements built on outrage can be powerful. They can mobilize people quickly. They can create intense feelings of purpose and solidarity, but they also burn out fast, because sustained outrage is exhausting. When the emotional intensity fades, and it always fades, people move to the next controversy, the next scandal, the next thing that makes them feel something strong. Meanwhile, the underlying problems remain unaddressed, because we were too busy feeling to actually think. Aristotle said that anyone can become angry. That is easy. But to be angry with the right person, to the right degree, at the right time, for the right purpose, and in the right way. That is not easy. We've built systems that make the easy part automatic and the difficult part nearly impossible. Can you recognize when your emotions are being manipulated? Can you feel strongly about something while still questioning whether your strong feelings are justified? That's the challenge of living in an economy that profits from keeping you outraged, and it's a challenge most people are losing. There's a particular kind of silence spreading through workplaces, universities, and communities. It's not the silence of having nothing to say. It's the silence of knowing that speaking honestly carries to higher cost. Imagine a professor who sees students adopting beliefs that are demonstrably false. The professor knows these beliefs will damage the students' ability to think critically, will limit their understanding of how the world actually works, will potentially harm their futures. But speaking up means student complaints, accusations of bias, possible threats to their career. So the professor stays quiet, watches students embrace nonsense, because honesty has become too expensive. This pattern appears everywhere. In corporations, where employees know the company is making disastrous decisions, but raising concerns gets you labeled as not a team player. In political parties, where members watch their side become increasingly extreme, but dissenting means exile. In families, where people observe destructive patterns, but intervention risks permanent estrangement. Socrates said, "The highest form of human excellence is to question oneself and others." But what happens when questioning becomes career suicide? When speaking truth risks punishment, while spreading comfortable lies guarantees acceptance? Here's something we need to acknowledge. The call to listen to the wise has historically been used to silence marginalized voices. Established experts were often the ones defending slavery, justifying segregation, excluding women from education. Sometimes silencing certain voices was necessary for progress. The question isn't whether all traditional authorities deserve platforms. The question is whether we can distinguish between necessary challenges to unjust power and mere performance, between substantive critique and noise designed to generate attention. What's concerning isn't that people are being challenged, it's how the challenge happens, when thoughtful disagreement becomes impossible, because any complexity gets weaponized. When people stay silent, not because their ideas are harmful, but because nuance doesn't survive in an environment that demands absolute certainty. Psychologists call this pluralistic ignorance. It happens when everyone privately disagrees with something, but each person assumes they're alone in their disagreement. So everyone stays quiet, everyone goes along, everyone pretends to agree, and the false consensus becomes real through sheer lack of opposition. The tragedy is that the people who stay silent aren't cowards. They're often the most thoughtful, the most careful, the most genuinely knowledgeable. They understand nuance, they see complexity, and they know that nuance and complexity get destroyed in environments that punish anything less than absolute certainty. Think about the last time you stayed silent when you should have spoken, not because your point was wrong or harmful, but because expressing it carefully and honestly felt too risky, because you knew that no matter how carefully you phrased it, someone would misrepresent your position in the worst possible way. You're not alone, and that's precisely the problem. When thoughtful voices go silent out of fear, society loses its capacity for productive disagreement. The loudest, most certain, least reflective voices face no opposition. They dominate simply because everyone with something meaningful to say has been intimidated into silence. John Stuart Mill wrote that he who knows only his own side of the case knows little of that. But we've created conditions where knowing multiple sides of a case and expressing that complexity publicly can destroy you. So people learn to perform certainty they don't feel, to express confidence in positions they privately question, to join pylons they secretly find disturbing, because the alternative is isolation. This is how societies stop thinking, not through government censorship, but through social pressure that makes honesty too costly for anyone to afford. Think about who gets celebrated in contemporary culture, who gets held up as someone to admire and emulate. Is it people of genuine virtue, those who demonstrate wisdom, integrity, compassion, moral courage? Or is it often people who have accumulated power, wealth, and influence regardless of how they obtained it? Socrates argued that virtue is the only thing worth pursuing, that a good life is one lived according to wisdom and moral principles, not one measured by material success or social status. But we've created a culture that celebrates results while remaining largely indifferent to methods. A tech founder who built their fortune through exploiting workers and crushing competitors still gets profiled as a visionary innovator. A celebrity who treats people terribly but maintains their brand still gets millions of followers and lucrative deals. A politician who lies constantly but wins elections gets analyzed as a master strategist rather than a moral failure. We seem to have separated success from virtue so completely that suggesting the two should be connected sounds almost quaint. Of course people cut corners. Of course they manipulate and deceive. Of course they prioritize personal gain over ethical behavior. That's just how the world works. That's being realistic. This separation is fueled by the same attention economy that rewards outrage. The path of virtue is often quiet and slow. It doesn't generate headlines or viral moments. The person who builds something meaningful over decades through honest work doesn't get the documentary. But the person who rises fast through questionable means then falls spectacularly. That's content. That's engagement. That generates clicks and commentary. We've built systems that profit more from documenting moral failures than from celebrating moral exemplars. And what gets monetized gets amplified. What gets amplified shapes what we value. This creates what psychologists call moral licensing, the tendency to excuse unethical behavior in people we perceive as successful. We tell ourselves their achievements justify their methods, that you can't make an omelette without breaking eggs, that they're playing the game better than everyone else, and we should admire their cunning. But here's what this does to society. It makes corruption aspirational. Young people learn that integrity is for losers, that doing the right thing matters less than getting ahead, that wisdom and virtue are nice in theory, but impractical in reality. Meanwhile, the person who chose integrity over shortcuts, who built slowly and ethically, who helped others along the way, they're forgotten, not because their achievements aren't impressive, but because virtue doesn't generate the kind of engagement our systems reward. Ancient Greek philosophers had a concept called eudaimonia, often translated as happiness or flourishing, but it really meant something deeper, living well by being good. The idea that the quality of your character determines the quality of your life. We've replaced eudaimonia with what? Instagram followers, net worth, media mentions. We measure success by everything except the metrics that actually matter. When was the last time you heard someone praised primarily for their character? When did you last see virtue celebrated as loudly as achievement? When did integrity become as valuable as influence? Those questions reveal how far we've drifted. In an idiocracy, the separation of success from virtue isn't a bug. It's the defining feature. When was the last time you heard someone say it's complicated and have that statement received as wisdom rather than evasion? We're living through an era of false binaries. Every issue gets reduced to exactly two opposing sides. Every question has one correct answer. Every problem has a simple solution that only fools or villains would oppose. The very concept of complexity has become suspicious. If something is complicated, it's probably because someone is trying to confuse you. Reality is nuanced. Most important issues involve trade-offs where there is no perfect solution, only choices between imperfect alternatives. Healthcare systems must balance quality, accessibility, and cost constraints. Criminal justice must weigh public safety against rehabilitation and civil rights. Environmental policy must consider ecological health alongside economic realities and human welfare. Immigration involves national security, economic impact, humanitarian obligations, and cultural integration. These aren't simple problems with obvious answers. They're complex systems where every intervention creates ripple effects, where reasonable people can disagree about priorities and approaches, but nuance doesn't translate into viral content. It doesn't fit on protest science. It can't be captured in tweets or sound bites. So we strip away complexity, turn every issue into a battle between good and evil, smart and stupid, us and them, and in doing so, we make solving actual problems nearly impossible. The disappearance of nuance creates predictable outcomes. First, it makes compromise look like betrayal. If there's only one right answer, anyone suggesting a middle path must be stupid or corrupt. Second, it makes people defensive. When every issue is framed as all or nothing, admitting any flaw in your position feels like total defeat. Third, it makes learning impossible. If acknowledging complexity is seen as weakness, no one can update their views based on new information without seeming completely wrong before. Socrates spent his life asking questions, exploring complexity, acknowledging what he didn't know. He understood that wisdom begins with recognizing how much you don't understand, but we've created an environment where admitting uncertainty is disqualifying, where the person who says, "I need to think about this more," gets dismissed, while the person claiming to have all the answers gets celebrated. What happens to a society that loses the ability to think in shades of grey, that can only process information as absolutely right or absolutely wrong? It becomes unable to solve complex problems because complex problems don't have simple solutions. It becomes perpetually at war with itself because every disagreement feels existential. It becomes a place where thoughtfulness is a liability and certainty, however unwarranted, is an asset. Friedrich Nietzsche warned that convictions are more dangerous enemies of truth than lies, because lies can be exposed, but convictions, deeply held beliefs that someone has placed at the core of their identity, those become impossible to challenge. When did you last change your mind publicly about something important? When did you last see someone rewarded for saying "I see merit in both perspectives"? The absence of those moments tells you everything about where we are. Socrates offered one final piece of wisdom. The secret of change is to focus all of your energy not on fighting the old, but on building the new. He understood that healthy societies are built by people committed to their own growth, their own wisdom, their own virtue. Every sign we've examined points to the same underlying condition: a culture that has drifted from valuing truth, wisdom, and genuine excellence. The Dunning-Kruger epidemic, knowledge as entertainment, the outrage economy, the silence of the thoughtful, success divorced from virtue, the disappearance of nuance. Socrates predicted this pattern. He warned that when societies stop holding truth sacred, other things rush to fill the void. History proves him right. Societies that silenced their philosophers and elevated their demagogues all followed similar trajectories, choosing what was loud, simple, and emotionally satisfying over what was true. But here's what gives me hope. You're watching this video. You're thinking about these ideas. You're questioning the patterns you see around you. That's exactly what Socrates would have encouraged. So what can you actually do? Let me offer some specific practices. Practice intellectual humility. Say "I don't know" and "I was wrong" out loud. Not as weakness, but as strength. Engage charitably. Before criticizing a position, make sure you truly understand it. Could you explain it in a way its strongest advocate would recognize? Curate your information diet. Actively follow thinkers who challenge you. If all your sources make you feel validated, you're not learning, you're being reinforced. Reward depth. When you see someone acknowledge complexity, appreciate their honesty instead of punishing them for not having simple answers. Signal that thoughtfulness has value. Embrace uncertainty. Not every question needs immediate resolution. Sometimes the wisest response is "I'm still thinking about this." Seek virtue over success. Ask yourself not just "Did I win?" but "Did I act with integrity?" Make character development as important as career development. These aren't grand gestures. They won't make you go viral. They won't get you celebrated. But they are forms of resistance against a system designed to make you reactive, tribal, uncertain. The question isn't whether you can single-handedly reverse cultural trends. You can't. The question is whether you're willing to be one person who refuses to participate in the worship of certainty over wisdom. One person who asks genuine questions. One person who admits when they don't know something. One person who rewards thoughtfulness. Because that's how change actually happens. Not through grand declarations, but through individual choices repeated consistently that slowly shift what gets valued and rewarded. Socrates saw this pattern 25 centuries ago. The question he would ask you today is simple. Now that you see it too, what are you going to do about it? The answer to that question will determine not just your own intellectual integrity, but the future of the culture you're part of. Choose wisely.